Hello and welcome once again to Vox Imperia, the Oculus Imperia podcast. Because again, I have one of these now. I am your host, the Oculus Imperia, except no substitutes. And with me, as last time, are my wonderful co-hosts, friends, educators both, excelsors in the eternal class struggle, Das and Sal. So say hi, gentlemen.
Hey, we're back.
Hello.
They didn't hate us the first time. We get to come back
maybe
now.
they did, but, you know, there's no getting rid of me.
They did not hate us the first time. In fact, the reception to the first episode was very warm and very kind, and I want to thank everyone for that reception. It's nice to be able to do something like this, speak a little bit more off the cuff, because in case you hadn't noticed, the channel's a little bit formal. So thank you for it. And delighted to be back again, and delighted to keep this thing going. Got some very cool plans for later on this year. So stay tuned. More on that later.
It's true, I've seen them. They're very cool.
They are cool plans. They are cool plans. Top of the hour, though, just a little bit of housekeeping. First off, thank you to all regular viewers of the channel for putting up with my little dental snafu that started this year off. As you can hear, I'm recovered, back to normal. Everything's good. Thank you for all the well wishes and the messages of support. That was extremely, extremely nice and very, very helpful to what was a little bit of an uncomfortable time. So thank you very much for that. In this episode, remember how in the last one we were talking about lore and how to get into it, and we said that to not start with the Horus Heresy. Well, we're going to start with the Horus Heresy, because what better thing to do on the second episode of something than launch yourself at a book series that has been running for 19 years and is technically not done. We talked about this a bunch and figured that it would actually be a kind of fun project to run through as much of it as we are even capable of possessing the stamina for.
There's so many of them, man. There's so many books in this series.
And not all of them are good.
No.
No. A lot of them are good. And some of them are not. My overriding maxim for how I like to approach being a person on the internet is to talk about things I love, not talk about things I hate. I don't like bringing negativity to what is a medium overflowing with constant, ceaseless rage engagement bait. So the thumbnail of this, I guarantee, is not going to be heresy bad in Terabang with a red arrow pointing to a circle or something like that, and my shocked face. Nevertheless, there will be opinions aplenty, because we have them and we like to talk about them.
Oh boy, golly,
do won't make it to a Kime novel in this much time.
Yeah, because it is important to say at the outset that, like, while, you know, we like and dislike so many different books in this series for a whole host of reasons, like, at the end of the day, like, you may enjoy the books we don't. You may dislike the books that we really like. It all comes down to, you know, personal preference, personal taste. And at the end of the day, like, even those books that we aren't particularly fond of, like, you know, it's nothing personal. These guys, writing is hard. Writing is really hard. These guys are out here writing books. We're certainly not. But, you know, nothing personal was felt, at least on the part of me. Sal does, in fact, hold genuine deep contempt and hatred for some of these people, but that's, you know.
I'm sure they're all very nice people. I'm sure I would get along great with them in person, and I'm going to leave it at that.
Yeah, like, this is not to yuck anyone's yum. And also, this is also from the perspective of people who have never published a novel, which is something that, you know, I like to remind myself whenever I talk about someone's work. But I assume that most people listening to this will have at least some grasp of what the Horus Heresy is. If you do not, welcome. Curious place to start, but love that for you. To introduce everything, the Horus Heresy is both a game and a series and also just a lore event. It is a cataclysmic apocalyptic conflict in the deep past of the Warhammer 40k universe, 10,000 years before the current timeline. And I've always liked to see it as it being the apocalypse that the 40k universe is the post-apocalypse of. Or rather, maybe 2 or 3 apocalypses after the first one. But it's the big apocalypse for the Imperium, as far as the Imperium is concerned, and thus as far as the 40k universe is concerned. It has existed in 40k canon since very early on, in the late 1980s, peppered in throughout various books and publications. Its first bit of fiction, and I'm pretty sure I'm correct in this, was a short story by William King, famed author of the Gotrek and Felix novels, for all you fantasy fans, who published a short story about the Siege of Terra and the death of Horus and the internment of the Emperor in a White Dwarf. The issue number escapes me. Sure, serves me right for not putting that on my show notes. Which I remember reading, even to this day, as being a very cool glimpse into a very cool event. But for the most part, that was all we got. Until a weird little time called 2003, when Games Workshop, in partnership with a company called Fantasy Flight Games, decided to release a collector's card game called the Horus Heresy. Now, there hadn't been any art for the Heresy at this time, beyond a couple of illustrations, so people set to work making it, and produced a slew of really extraordinarily cool artwork that a lot of Horus Heresy fans hold in a bit of a special place. If you haven't ever seen Visions of Heresy, which I believe is the term for the latest edition of the collected works of it, go check it out if you can get your hands on a copy, because it's very rare these days that you see Games Workshop allow Space Marines to go off-model. And collected Visions and Visions of Heresy, as it's been known throughout its time, is gloriously weird. There are power armor marks that correspond to no actual type, because it's a bunch of artists kind of going hog wild on a part of Warhammer history that has no boundaries or definitions on it, beyond some very vague stuff. I know, Sal, you're a big fan of the Visions
I
books.
love Visions of Heresy. It's weird in a way that nothing else in Warhammer is, really. Because it's a bunch of artists who aren't experienced with Warhammer or the classic aesthetics that we're all used to at this point. Just doing what they can with what they're given. And it's just absolutely fantastic. If you ever want inspiration for a new strange Space Marines army, just flip open Visions of Heresy to any page, and you'll have more inspiration than you can handle.
Could not agree more. It's a really, really cool book. Or 4 books, technically. It's a collected edition. Anyway. Subsequent to that, some canny commissioning editors of the Black Library noticed that this could be a good setting to explore, perhaps in prose. And in 2006, the very first Horus Heresy book, Horus Rising by Dan Abnett, was published. To say that this is a success is kind of an understatement. There were 54 books that followed it in the mainline series, and then a further, I think, 14 in total in the Siege of Terra, if you count the novellas and the final anthology, and include End and the Death as 3 books, because it is.
I don't count the novellas, but that's because I'm petty and hate them.
I still think they should release a collected copy of End and the Death.
I don't think that that's physically possible to publish. I don't think that you can manage that from just a general laws of physics arrangement. At about a dozen books or so into the Horus Heresy series, the actual tabletop game caught up, and Forge World, as they were known then, released the first of a series of what have become to known as the Black Books, campaign expansions for Horus Heresy, the tabletop wargame, at the time a spin-off of the mainline Warhammer 40k tabletop game. This is a bit of an interesting point in Horus Heresy kind of like development and canon, as what we have here with the Black Books represents almost a... I don't ever want to refer to it as a separate canon, because that kind of is not how canon works in the 40k universe and kind of elsewhere too, but I digress. It forms a very interesting companion to the novel series, because the novel series are prose. They have characters, they have character development, they have plot arcs, etc., etc. The Black Books, as I'm sure many of you probably know at this point, are written from a diegetic perspective. That is in universe. That is exactly how I do my channel, because if it was not for the Black Books, this channel would not exist. I owe everything stylistically to what those books did. And because of it, it's a very interesting world to explore, because stuff happens in the Black Books that does not happen in the novel series, and a lot of stuff in the novel series happens that is not reflected in the Black Books at all. And, in some cases, things happen in the Black Books slightly differently to how they happen in the novels. Because, again, the diegetic in-universe perspective means that you can't quite get into the head of a Primarch as he's debating something. So it opens some very interesting narrative hooks that I just kind of find endlessly fascinating. And the interplay between them is rich, to say the very least.
I mean, hell, even in the novels themselves, you're not going to find total consistency. You'll find just plot points that are completely different between one novel and another for just, reasons as simple as one author didn't read the last book particularly carefully or at all. And yeah, trying to do any kind of really cohesive canon for the Heresy series is a good way to just drive yourself insane.
I think it's that unreliable canon that makes the Horus Heresy so interesting, because you have frequently the same event told from 3, 4, 5, any number of different points of view, and none of them will agree with each other. And it's really representative of almost Warhammer as a whole, where lies are crucial to the maintenance of every single faction. So having these lies even within the lore that's supposed to be ironclad, or at least that some take as ironclad, really reflects the in-universe themes of, like, everything is true but nothing is true.
Exactly. It is a great way to kind of litmus test yourself in how well you can navigate a universe full of unreliable narrators and conflicting plot points, conflicting lore points. It's fun. And herein lies the fun. And this is what I love about it. If anything, the Horus Heresy is a little bit of a kind of case study in 40k lore in miniature, or within like a little bit of a nesting case, in that it is a massive collaborative fiction project written over decades by very different people, some of whom never return, some of whom are there throughout and change and develop as authors and creatives throughout their time working on the project. And I kind of love it for that.
Oh, same. Yeah, like watching the way that some of the big authors within the series just develop as writers. So yeah, it's over the course of the better part of 20 years. Like, you've got Dan Abnett at the start and end of this series. And like, you compare Horus Rising, which is a fantastic book. That's not to say that like it wasn't good, but the evolutions in his prose in Horus Rising compared to, any of his Siege of Terror books, whether it's Saturnine or any of the End of the Death stuff, like it's remarkable. Just his growth as a creative, as a writer, like it's so cool to see.
I mean, between this first Heresy book and the last one, Dan Abnett has written, I think, 15 or 20 Warhammer books and stories. And so just through sheer dint of how much writing, you have to see evolution.
I mean, maybe?
Exactly.
I mean, I think plenty of people could just write lots of books and not develop, theoretically, I guess.
Fair.
On that note, we have decided, because we're insane, to just throw ourselves right into this and review, maybe is the right word, talk about, discuss every novel in the Heresy series in a greater or lesser degree, probably depending on our enthusiasm for it, what it introduces, what it brings up, and whatever little lore tidbits kind of come across our minds as we do so. This will be full spoilers. So if for whatever reason you have any desire to not be spoiled on books that are in some cases 19 years old or less, might skip this one. But if you don't mind sticking around, we will be here to talk about them as they come up.
I will also say, I don't think the Horus Heresy is a book series that your enjoyment will be reduced by knowing spoilers.
Absolutely.
A lot of the spoilers are not going to make you go, now I don't need to read that book. If anything, they'll make you say, oh, now I have to read that book, because something I really enjoy or something I'm excited to see happens in it. I went into the Horus Heresy already having most of it spoiled for me.
Same.
And I loved it. I loved every minute of it. And, you know, it's set 10,000 years in the past. Knowing about 40k lore is spoilers for big parts of it. I mean, the first line of the first book is, I was there the day Horus slew the Emperor. And while that's a bit of a, red herring in the context of the novel, that is the ending of the series, effectively, is the Emperor's death at Horus's hands. So, spoilers are to be expected.
And I think that is actually a phenomenal way to segue into talking about Book 1 in the series, 2006's Horus Rising by Dan Abnett, which, as Sal says, opens with the line, I was there the day Horus slew the Emperor. Which, as far as ways to start a book series that is 54 plus 14 books long, not that I think anyone who was working on that book in any capacity knew that would be the case going in. Great way to begin.
And that's kind of one of the things that I really enjoy about this book, is that in the same way that when you go back and read like the Eisenstein books, you can see kind of Abnett really just kind of figuring stuff out, is kind of taking the first steps into this new narrative setting that had never been really explored in this fashion. And Horus Rising is kind of the same thing, where he has stuff to work with. He has the benefit of having kind of the major players of the drama laid out, as far as Horus, the Emperor, the Primarchs, a couple of big name Space Marines for the most part. But other than that, he had a free hand here. He's kind of trying to figure out how you actually take lore points and translate them into actual compelling narrative, which is way harder than most people think. Like actually creating a well-structured drama out of lore, which really doesn't provide any kind of character dimensions, is so hard. And obviously, because it's Dan Abnett, it's incredible. And there are going to be bits in there that, don't line up with the ways in which both the lore and the stories evolve in later books. Like there are, straight up just lore retcons that mean that some of the stuff that's said in there just doesn't mean anything anymore. But man, the fact that he is able to come out of the gate like this and create a book like this, because it really does set the model for the entire series. Like I remember years ago, I was watching an interview with him, and he was talking about his approach, saying that he went in kind of viewing the heresy as like the Imperium's founding mythology, and he wanted to kind of figure out a way to narratively engage with it as mythology. And man, is that so evident in the way that he writes, not just this book, really all of the heresy books that he helps.
I couldn't agree more. And I think mythology and mythological storytelling is a good way to steer your course through, at the very least, like a good quantity of the heresy novels before it essentially becomes its own setting. in and of itself. Because right here with Horus Rising, we have a book that doesn't know that it's going to be a 54-book series. I would need to sit down with Dan himself, maybe one day, and talk about exactly how the genesis of this book came about, because I would love to have been a fly on the wall at that commissioner's editors meeting. But yeah, he's taking fragments and he's now being told to flesh it out, populate it with characters. And that's how we have, Horus. Okay, yeah, we know Horus. And like, Sanguinius and Rogel Doran, they're all both in this in some capacity. And then as you go down, you see other names. And it's like, who the hell is Ezekiel Abaddon? Like, Lucius, I recognize that name. That's that weird guy from The Emperor's Children. And then after it, you're into, who the hell is Hastur Sejanus? Who the hell is Tybalt Mar or Verulam Moy? He's having to populate a universe essentially from scratch. And does it in a way that is, I will say this as someone who picked this book up at its second printing, it kind of world-shattering, because the Imperium here is utterly the opposite of the one that you, as a 40K fan, picking this book up for the first time, have come to be accustomed to. It is progressive. It is scientific. It is, at its core, atheistic. It is a juggernaut of progress, albeit progress built on the backs of a military regime, thundering into the galaxy with all of these highfalutin ideas of openness and liberation and freedom, again, on the back of a military regime. And it's so wildly different that it can't help but make an impression right out of the gate.
And I think one of the most astounding things about Abnett's world building in this book is how much of it is important to the overall plotline. Like, just looking back at a summary again of this book and looking at character names and realizing, these are characters that will be important for almost every book of the 67, 70 books in this series. He sets up so many plot lines and stories and character arcs that you don't get a solid conclusion for 2 decades. And he does it in a way that it doesn't feel like any of them have to be majorly changed.
Even looking at this, like, Dramatis Personae breakdown, I'm trying to pick out ones that have, like, that start where they start here and go in a completely different direction from where they are between the first page of Horus Rising and the last one. And I'm kind of failing to see any that do in any major capacity. Like, Raldoron is here, but first captain of the Blood Angels, but he just gets fleshed out later on. That's it. He's set dressing as far as this book is concerned, but he's here. And it should also be pointed out that going and looking through Visions of Heresy is a very interesting activity, because there are a whole lot of named characters there who are just created for the card game, who then later get picked up by people writing these first Heresy novels. Like, Ignatius Grolgor of the Death Guard is one. Just a named Death Guard character in a card game who then becomes a reasonable player in the Death Guard Legion storyline.
And I also, just to kind of add on to this, is I really love that this book also gives a really incredible approach that is carried through by most of the good work in the series, that is able to center regular human characters alongside Space Marines, Primarchs, and these just superhuman characters in ways that doesn't make it feel like they're add-ons. They are just as crucial to the narrative. They are just as vital a character as, the big name Space Marines. And I really think that throughout the entire Horus Heresy series, the books that are able to really do that, to me, very much stand out. And that trend really gets started here.
I think it's a bit of a hallmark of at least our love for any books that involve Space Marines is that you do tend to need an unaugmented human or a few to contrast them properly. Because how are you going to properly describe the awe that a human can feel for an Astartes or a Primarch without having a human there?
Yeah.
Levels. Exactly. Levels are important. As much as we heap praise on this, it is not without its like weird little foibles, which are again a facet of Dan being told to build this from the ground up. There's just odd little quirks that in only laterally you're going to notice going back and reading this after, every single division of the Legion as Astartes has now been given a unit or a name. Like, a lot of 41st millennium terminology will sneak in here. Like Adeptus Astartes gets dropped a couple of times instead of Legion as Astartes. There are, Devastator squads instead of Legion heavy support squads. I think he says Adeptus Custodes instead of Legio Custodes. Sanguinius is also described as having black hair, which I think is the worst lore crime that Dan Abnett has ever committed.
I didn't even remember that one. Oh my god.
I think since we are still on the first book, I think a big part of the Horus Heresy, if you start at the beginning, you do really have to treat it like a mythology, like we were saying earlier.
Yeah.
In that you don't go into Greek mythology saying, I'm going to read it all. You go into Greek mythology, you read the most crucial books, like maybe the Odyssey, the Iliad. And then you go from there, choosing the characters or the stories or the themes that you find interesting. And you really have to do the same thing with the Horus Heresy. I would read the first 3 Heresy books, and then choose what you enjoy. Because if you try to go through all of it, you might not have as good of a time as you would otherwise.
Yeah, and especially because it is not linear. It's extremely alinear, in a way that better and more dedicated people than I have constructed flowcharts of how to navigate it, and I've seen circuitry diagrams that are less complicated.
Yeah, and like very much in line with a lot of like modern comic runs, the Heresy is definitely an example of something where if you, skip a couple of books and are, picking up a novel later on down the road and you see some character come up again that you don't know who they are, just go look them up. Like, you can just go to the wikis and figure out who this character is, without having to feel like you just know nothing about, key characters that you might have missed just by skipping a book or two.
Interestingly enough, like, what you just mentioned there is a facet of modern comic book storytelling where I can't help but feel, and this is a bit of a theory, but I think it's pretty solid, that a lot of comic book writers these days can get to write stories and write issues knowing that the user has the reader has their smartphone right beside them. So a character's history can be Googled at the drop of a hat if it's needed to, which was not the case previously, where you read old comic book issues and every character kind of has to have their power or recent history summarized in every issue. It same too kind of goes for, I think, 40K. This is not at the expense of character development or character setup, but by book 30 whatever of the series, there's enough people making wiki entries that I believe that the author can rest easy that they don't have to summarize the events of every episode thus far.
And as you read it, you'll notice that reflected in the writing too, where the first 10 or 15 books will do good recaps on the characters, and then as you get later in the series, they just kind of assume that you know who the character is. And that's not to its detriment. I mean, no one should be picking up book 35 and saying, this is going to be my new starting point. But for the first 10, you can kind of choose anything, and it'll fill you in on what you missed.
And with that, we can move on to the sequel to Horus Rising, False Gods by Graham McNeill, a book that picks up directly where the first one left off. At the end of Horus Rising, we have Horus having dealt with a crisis with a human-alien hybrid society called the Interrex, on his way to Davin, which, as canon has already established, is the site where he falls. Graham at the time was big at the Black Library, big at Games Workshop. He had a bunch of hits with his Ultramarine novel series, so was a fairly natural choice for who would follow Dan's heresy path. And False Gods quite honestly delivers a lot on what the first one set up. We get a lot more characters having their worlds kind of shaken up. The crisis at the end of the first book has really disrupted everyone's lives in a major way, and a lot of characters are now having to question their place in the universe. The one thing that gets me, and I think that the overarching feeling I always have whenever I've gone back and revisited the opening trilogy, is just how much stuff, how much giant universe shaping events are squeezed into these 3 books by sheer dint of the fact that the authors didn't know that there'd be another 50-something for them to get to do.
Yeah, like when you compare like how certain subsequent events in the heresy are, I'm not going to say padded out, but certainly given a lot of space. Like these first 2 books easily could have been 4 or 5 books, and it wouldn't have felt like these events were getting, sped through.
We could have had a dozen books before the Dropsite Massacre.
Yeah.
Easily. And instead it has to happen in 3. We get both Istvan 3, and we get Istvan 5 by the 4th book. Which again is just, it seems like mind-bogglingly fast for those of us who are used to, as Daz has pointed out, paced out storytelling in the later books in the series.
We'll be charitable. We'll call it a languid approach to storytelling.
Good.
I think that's both one of the strengths and weaknesses of these first 3, is that it gives you so much that it is really what you need to pick up anything else in the series, but at the same time it means that these world-shattering events are kind of, I won't say glossed over, because they're very much not. We do get in-depth views of all of it. It just goes fast, and you have to keep track of it.
Yeah, like, given that the final confrontation between Horus and the Emperor took place over 3 of some of the longest Warhammer books I have ever read, the fact that Horus's fall to chaos happens essentially in the space of the back half of one regularly sized novel can seem a bit off-putting in some ways, and yet it's fairly consistent given what we know of Horus's past from canon that had existed previously, given how Horus had been set up in the very first novel in the series. So it's not, it's only, I feel it's only quick in retrospect.
Yeah, definitely. They are not rushed novels, but compared to the later ones, yes.
And like, I realize we're still on False Gods, but it almost kind of makes sense to kind of talk about both False Gods and Book 3 Galaxy in Flames almost in tandem with one another, because that's where you really get the acceleration. Because like, I don't know, I feel like Horus Rising definitely takes its time with some stuff, but books 2 and 3 are where you really like, okay, we're going through what is probably, a handful of years in universe time in relatively quick succession. Again, encompassing everything from Horus's fall all the way up through Istvan 3. And yeah, there's a lot there. And to their credit, while both of these books have their flaws, I think they both do a pretty respectable job as far as hitting the major narrative beats without completely losing that relatively strong approach to characterization that Dan lays down in the first book. Not as well as he does, but like, expecting other authors to, reach Dan Abnett's level of character construction is a little unfair in my opinion.
I agree. I think that, to Graham's credit in False Gods, one of the prime motivators for Horus's fall in the dream sequence he has when he's lying in a fugue state on Davin is that he sees a vision of the 40K galaxy. And it's essentially presented to him as, this is what'll happen if you're not careful, when in fact it's just the future as is, which I kind of just love. It kind of very neatly encapsulates the doomed inevitability of the 40K universe, that the horror nightmare terror hell that the universe is the thing that ends up causing the universe's fall in a, I don't know, it depends on your own personal taste for what are kind of causality loops, but hey, the warp is achronological. So I personally, on a reread of it, found it quite succinct in a way that neatly steps around the need to write, I don't know, a dozen books on exactly why Horus did what he did, which, by the way, is something the Black Books almost entirely sidestep thanks to the diegetic perspective. You don't need to get inside the head of a Primarch if you're writing as if you're a historian.
And that vision of the future, you mentioning that reminds me that that's something that is a consistent theme throughout the series, and especially in the Siege of Terra books. Mm-hmm. Because that same horrific vision of what the galaxy will be after the Horus Heresy is something that gets brought back probably most strikingly when Karn is fighting Sigismund. And he gets
such
a
a
view
great
of
sequence.
What the future of the Imperium is, and it enrages him, or almost frightens him. And the fact that the Imperium, in what it becomes by 40K, which is, you know, our baseline, is something enough to terrify Karn the Betrayer.
Or this, like, never even mind Karn, like, terrify Horus Lupercal.
Yeah.
Like, the brightest star, you know? Like, the arch betrayer is so scared of committing the future that is the one he's committing that he ends up committing it.
Yeah, that's
again, when we talk about mythological strokes, this is what we mean. And as Das says, moving on to Galaxy in Flames by Ben Counter, you have the culmination of this arc in a way that, like, while I feel that Galaxy in Flames on a prose level is in some ways the weakest of the initial trilogy, it manages to stick the landing in a lot of really good ways.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
It does what it needs to do. It is successful in getting the plot points and the themes across and setting the stage
and the character arcs.
And the character arcs for the rest of the series. These first 3 books really are the foundation that the rest of it is built on.
Even if they may not have intended to be a foundation originally from the get-go, they serve as an excellent one. And again, you can go back and read this and come up with all sorts of little foibles. For example, I remember that according to Galaxy in Flames by Istvan III, Karn had already fully fallen to Khorne's influence and was chanting about blood for the blood god and the eightfold path and stuff on Istvan III, which, you know, that's something that you say if you don't know how much more time you have to play with.
It could be the warp storms.
Yeah.
When in doubt, blame it on the warp.
Yeah, blame it on the
warp storms, man.
The absolute crowning glory moment of Galaxy in Flames, though, is the Let the Galaxy Burn sequence. 10 out of 10. No notes. Wouldn't change a thing about a bunch of human remembrancers being forced to watch Horus make his grand declaration.
Oh yeah,
like, it's just flawless.
It's melodramatic in all the right ways. Oh yeah, it's like I definitely agree that on a prose level, especially when you stack it up against Abnett's work, definitely is the runt of the litter. But man, the big hits, the big set pieces that need to hit in this book, they hit. And Counter definitely deserves credit on that front.
As does the wrapping up of the character arcs.
Yeah,
the character arcs
sure.
are
definitely, yeah.
landed extremely well. Also, I can't remember if it was book 3 or book 2, but at one point, Torgaden calls Loken a drama queen, which is just a phenomenal tidbit that I love that term lasts into the 31st millennium.
I'm here for it.
After Galaxy in Flames comes Flight of the Eisenstein by James Swallow, which is something of a... It's almost a book 3.5 instead of necessarily a book 4, as it picks up essentially midway through Galaxy in Flames and then takes it slightly further after. It involves the flight of the Death Guard heavy frigate Eisenstein as it flees the Istvan system, where the Purge of the Legions is ongoing, and takes us up to the point where news of the disaster reaches Rogel Dorn and the Imperial Fists on Terra. It's tasked with taking a bunch of characters from the first trilogy and kind of running with it, while also centering the plot around Nathaniel Garrow, who, again, I think somewhat contrary to expectations, would last all the way to the damn end. Like,
well, pretty close to it anyway, yeah.
Yeah, good for you, Nathaniel. Absolutely good for you. You stayed the course. And with the same author, too. So props to you, James Swallow.
Yeah, this book is, again, it's interesting in a lot of ways. A little weird in places, just kind of where it fits in, because, yeah, it does feel like those first 3 books are kind of a nice pre-narrative cut. And then it's kind of both, covering what's happening elsewhere, while at the same time introducing some new characters, giving us a little bit more of the old. Again, Garrow is definitely the big introduction here. We get a little bit of stuff from the Sol system, complete with fighting demons on the moon and all that fun stuff. I mean, just for me, I don't know. I think I enjoy this book a little bit less in hindsight, and that's not even James Swallow's fault. It's just that ever since Chris Rake took over writing a lot of the Death Guard stuff, starting with Lords of Silence from 2016, 2017, I can't go back. No offense, James. I just can't.
The Death Guard are presented very well in their first proper outing. And again, it's kind of comes down to a matter of personal taste, but I mean, I largely agree. It should be interesting though that Solon Decius, the Lord of Flies, almost makes it all the way to the Siege of Terra. Like, he lasts until the final book in the series, and I think the Buried Dagger is the last time we saw the Lord of Flies.
Yes.
Which again, a demon being punched on the moon. Extremely cool vibes coming off that one.
You can't go wrong with fighting demons on the moon. I mean, that sentence is probably in the top 10 coolest sentences ever written. So
the moon is haunted. Loads gone. We also have the neat little genesis of the Inquisition bit, which was great, and another example of the books getting ahead of themselves, because once it got figured out that the heresy needed way more material, the whole Inquisition thing got delayed till way later, and instead we now have Malcador's own secret police, his agents. But it's funny to hear a setup happening and then watching it almost immediately get delayed for the sake of including more story.
Oh man, we got 8 more years of in-universe events to take care of. Well, I can wait.
Exactly. 8, wasn't it? Wait, hang on. No, you're right.
9? 8 or 9? Close enough.
Oh no. Oh dear. It
was 9 years.
Yeah, I thought it was. It's Van 3 to...
Well, sometimes it said to last 7, sometimes it said to last 9. And from Terra's perspective, it lasts an unknown amount of time because time ceases to exist by the end. So
and we got sidereal time, warp, chronal distillation, all of this other stuff. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who pays attention to dates or numbers when it comes to Warhammer. But number 5 in the series is Fulgrim, where we have returning author Graham McNeil from False Gods picking up a bunch of plot threads from False Gods and really rocketing the series forward quite a bit. Fulgrim is, we call it what it is. It's a divisive novel in the lore points it lays out. I don't think that is a controversial statement.
I wouldn't say so.
No, not at all.
Yeah, it's... Some people love it, some people hate it, and some of the people who love it also hate it.
The strength of Graham's prose is very evident here. It's eminently readable. He's throwing a lot of ideas into the mix, and a lot of them form a pretty solid understanding of the Emperor's Children throughout the Heresy. I think out of many of the legions that the books cover, the Emperor's Children have one of the most uninterrupted arcs. And considering that they were there since literally book 2, Fulgrim is a character in False Gods. He returns here in his own eponymous novel. The Legion as a whole has a precipitous drop off a very tall cliff. And I think they fall faster than most anyone else.
It is a pretty 0 to 100 ship for that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we get the infamous scene with the creation of the first Noise Marines, or Cacophony, as the series will have to dub them for rule of cool reasons alone. The Maravigila is, again, one of those scenes that kind of bounces around. I'm not going to call it surface level 40k lore discourse, but mid-range 40k lore discourse, as the thing that is like, oh my god, it's so insane, it's so crazy, it's so this, it's so that. And I won't lie, for the time, it was. And serves as a good introduction to just how insane things are going to get for the Emperor's Children. I don't know what your guys' thoughts are on it, but at least for me, I won't lie, the Fulgrim killed Ferris because a demon was possessing him plot point that get introduced here is not great.
It's kind of sad. It takes what could have been a very mythical, important, like very, very Greek almost story of a brother striking down his favorite brother for reasons that are beyond his control, but he still has to, and turns it into, he was turned evil by a sword, lol.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to see it that way. It's hard not to see it as spooky sword made me kill my brother, which in some ways can kind of be seen as mythical. I don't know why. It's just never really sat with me quite well. Also, unfortunate in that we get one novel with Ferrus Manus and then he's offed. We don't get any time to actually get to develop the relationship. We don't get any time to really live and breathe with their relationship. So the death of Ferrus at Fulgrim's hands doesn't hit the way the death of Loken at Abaddon's hands hits. And that's simply because there hasn't been enough time. Which is ironic considering that, Loken is an Astartes that has never existed before the series, and Ferrus Manus is literally a Primarch.
It is strange that we get almost nothing with Ferrus. It makes it so that when he falls and his sons do what they do, it doesn't feel like it's proportional. But it is kind of representative, I guess, of almost how Visions portrays it even, where Ferrus exists to die. He's a character that exists purely to get his head cut off. Yeah. And that's sad, because he could be so much more, and the Black Books show us that.
And it is here we begin to have the hard plot points that the series starts to introduce, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but Fulgrim might have been the first time that we got confirmed that Ferrus fell properly, died stone cold, head cut off, completely OMG dead. It becomes almost a bit of a narrative problem. It's a huge narrative act for sure, but previously in the lore, the fates of most Primarchs were completely unknown beyond the ones that got covered in Index Astartes articles that sort of was a bit of a heresy lore stopgap between the original William King story and the Visions collections. Like, we know that Guilliman fell at the hand of Fulgrim because of that. We know that Alfarius died, quote unquote, fighting Guilliman. We know that Kurz was killed by a Calidus assassin. We never knew what happened to Ferris. Again, someone in the comments, correct me if I'm wrong, give me the engagement, until Fulgrim cuts his head off because he got scared and a demon inside a sword possessed a Primarch.
Yeah, and I think this also helps illustrate the fact that not every legion or faction is going to get anywhere near the same kind of love in this series, in that there are legions, Primarchs, and the works that get more or less completely transformed by this series. Like, they get books and exploration that it's almost crazy to talk about the difference, like, before and after their heresy books. Like, you talk about legions like the White Scars with Chris Wraith's books, or the World Eaters with Aaron Dembski Bowden's books. Like, they completely change how that legion is seen, and to the better in a frankly outrageous degree. But there are also legions that just get nothing. They just get so little. The Iron Hands are probably the worst offenders on there. They just get screwed. They get nothing. The Raven Guard don't get much at all. I'll let Sal spout off his salamanders.
We get a lot into that. Salamanders get a lot of books
later, but yeah, and that's something to know going in, is that if you're waiting for, like, oh, surely we'll get, my favorite legion, they're going to get their time in the sun eventually, right? Well, maybe not, depending on
not necessarily
what you're looking for.
There are, however, certain parts of lore that get filled in this that give us hints that the series is going to go a little bit longer than the initial set of offerings would lead us to assume. For one thing, Eldrad Ultran shows up for the first time in Heresy canon.
Oh God, I forgot that.
Oh yeah,
yeah, he does. He's really that old. And we also get what I think is one of the best plot points that the series opens up. This book opens up for the series, rather, is that Fabius, a chief apothecary of the Legion, laterally Fabius Bile, man of extremely fashionable coats made of skin, has already kind of been futzing around with the Legion's gene seed, and it is a wonderful moment in that it first illustrates that, like, hey, for all the wonderful progress and amazing ideals and all of these things that the Imperium of this time espouses before the heresy, rot has kind of started setting in, and maybe not every legion is exactly as great as it likes to think it is.
Yeah.
Descent into horror is very much a theme of the Horus Heresy, because at the beginning of it, like Oculus mentioned, it's very much the glittering city on the hill. It's a beacon of truth and beauty and art and science. And by the end of the series, it's not exactly, but very close to the Imperium we have in 40k, which is, to be a man in the grimmest regime imaginable.
And what's interesting about that perspective, though, is that the thought just struck me that the perspective we're fed on the Imperium in False Gods is essentially entirely in the hands, or from the mouths, rather, of an Astartes who believes it 100% no questions asked, Garvia Loken, and a bunch of remembrancers who, while maybe slightly disillusioned, are generally pretty happy with the status quo that has now come to exert itself.
Yeah, literally professional propagandists.
Literally professional propagandists who can see through certain trappings of the regime, but for the most part, are people who have been like, well, it's better than, being victims of a war.
And the Imperium that we're getting has just finished the Unification Wars. It's just finished bringing humanity back into the fold. And for the average citizen, it's a golden age.
It's been 200 years of a golden age at this point. Well, yeah, 100 to be correct.
We're seeing the Roman Empire under Augustus. And by 40k, we're seeing it under Romulus Augustulus, beset by barbarians on every side and unable to hold itself together.
Those are some references for all you classics majors in the audience.
Ew.
It's not my fault I took Latin.
Speaking of descents, though,
oh boy, God.
The next novel in the series is quite interesting in that it's just one of the curious parts of these early years. It's 2007's Descent of Angels by Mitchell Scanlon, the sixth book in the series, which covers the Dark Angels. And it is one of only 2 novels written by Mitchell Scanlon. The other one being the somewhat notorious 15 Hours novel, 40k novel about the Imperial Guard, which is a great book. That has fundamentally altered how a lot of people view life expectancy in the Imperial Guard to a Flanderized degree. That is no fault of the author and entirely the fault of how memes propagate on the internet. But Descent of Angels covers the Dark Angels from their pre-reunification with the Imperium time on Caliban to an interesting little part in the Great Crusade. Curiously, Descent of Angels, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, Zahariel, the main character, survives all the way to Terra?
Yeah, he's one of the Fallen who makes planetfall with Coruscant.
Yeah, which is, to an extent, given how everything else in this book is completely abandoned, quite funny.
It's interesting because I think more so than the others, at least at the kind of the front end of the heresy, both in terms of the novels as well as, and you would probably know better than this on this arc, the Black Books themselves. I feel like it took Games Workshop a while to figure out what the 30k Dark Angels were.
100%. I have an abiding theory that they tried to do something with the Dark Angels with 2 very early Dark Angels novels and established some parts of their canon that remained. A knightly order on Caliban, introduced into canon that Caliban is actually just almost irrevocably corrupted by chaos, but no one can see it. And everything else kind of languished for a long time, and I mean over a decade, until someone at GW, I expect Alan Bly, and I could be wrong with that,
praise
I do not know the inner workings, praise be unto Alan Bly, decided to really codify what the first angels were, the Dark Angels were, and then when the Black Books ended up getting around to them, along with some prose work by David Geimer in later Heresy series, they finally got fleshed out. Right at the end of the Heresy series when it was kind of coming to a close and wrapping up. But in Descent of Angels, we have an interesting kind of gestation point, despite the fact that most of the seeds planted in this novel don't go anywhere.
Yeah, it's kind of like of all the earliest books, it's kind of that if there's one that just always tends to just be forgotten about in this first run, it's generally this. Largely because, for all intents and purposes, most of the major plot points don't survive very long, outside, again, of a couple of named characters popping up way, way down the line. It's not really kind of moving the broader narrative forward all that much. And especially given that, again, the Dark Angels as a faction become way more interesting and fleshed out later on down the road, I would guess this is probably the book that's most often skipped. in this
and there's
run.
no, like, it's not a bad bit of prose in and of itself. It's a well-written novel. It's not terrible. In the context of the series, it's odd because
it feels like
as you mentioned,
standalone novel.
It feels like, yes, exactly. It feels standalone in that it doesn't really have any impact on anything else other than its sequel, which happens later under a different author. The lion, as he's presented in this novel, is completely different to the lion that we will see later on. And I don't even mean in terms of his upbringing on Caliban. Even the points in the Crusade where we get him, he's not the same guy. He's a very different, very closed off, very stoic type of character, but not in any way the guy we get later on.
Yeah.
This book, I think you could read it on its own and really enjoy it, but I don't think it's really fundamentally a part of the Horus Heresy as we know it.
However, it is followed by something that is fundamentally part of the Horus Heresy series as we know it. In what, like, I will talk to the day till the day runs out about this book, Legion by Dan Abnett, published 2008, which covers the Alpha Legion for the first time. So Dan, returning back to the Heresy setting, comes in swinging. So the novel is set slightly before any of the events that he covered in Horus Rising. And just, this is Dan at kind of like some of my favorite, because he is just getting a weird little corner of a universe and just doing whatever the hell he wants with it. And it's kind of staggering the amount of lore that gets built into this novel that has to be used because of how big it is.
Yeah. So like,
does it get used well? Not always.
Yeah. So those of you who know will know
is interesting.
Like, this is a book that obviously the three of us absolutely adore on like every imaginable level. We love this book so much. I think I speak for all three of us when I say this is Dan at his peak. This is absolute Dan cooking. But several of the things it introduces are very contentious, represent probably one of the things that get hated on the most in discourse about the Heresy series, for both good and bad reasons. And those of you who have read this book know exactly what I'm talking about. It is the perpetual subplot in and around John Grammaticus and the Cabal. And man, the just pure amount of argumentation and takes on this is just, it's violent. It's very, very violent.
You know that you have fundamentally disrupted lore and, to an extent, canon, quote unquote, when everyone will argue about your work till the day runs out. Yes, as Das says, this is the book where we get introduced to perpetuals for the first time. What exactly are perpetuals? We don't really know by the end of this book, except it seems they are immortal humans. Cool. The 40k universe has immortal humans right now that aren't the Emperor. First time that's ever happened. Who the hell is John Grammaticus? We don't know. He's got a cool name, and if the audiobook is to be believed, he's the only American left alive in the 40k universe.
Yep, which is a touch that I absolutely adore, and it persists across multiple audiobook narrators. So it was clear that some direction was given after they recorded this book. Yep, this Grammaticus, he's from New York. Just go with it.
And it fits him because he's the man who speaks every language. You know, of course, he would speak in a way unlike every other person in the universe because he is unlike every other person.
And hot take, love John Grammaticus.
Oh,
I do not care what anyone's opinions of him are. He is weird. He is an uncomfortable addition that many have with the setting. He is, to an extent, protected by the most inviolable plot armor imaginable. I don't care. I love him. He is such a weird outgrowing of 40K's imagination and his persistent survival despite being, generally speaking, quite unpleasant as an individual is just, I don't know.
He's kind of a dick, isn't he?
I like him in the sense that, like, he seems like a character from a James Gunn superhero team-up, like, where they're all a bunch of assholes.
Yeah.
Like, he'd fit right in with Suicide Squad, just generally speaking.
Absolutely. And I will say this
I'm not even getting to the main lore points of this, which is even bigger, because we haven't, for the book about the Alpha Legion, we're not even talking about the Alpha Legion yet, which is precisely how this book unfolds, because for the most part, it doesn't really involve them. They're in it, but they rarely show up. And in place of it, we get some of, it's just Dan's lore at its best. He just creates an insane amount of weird for this particular period in 40K, like, history. His work with the Imperial Army, the Exertus Imperialis, just creating random regiments because they sound cool is something I will never get tired of. Yeah. Like, we have in this book the Lucifer Blacks, the Geno 5-2 Chiliad, the Reginald Thorns, the Outramars, the Crescent Sind 6th Torrent. That implies that there are many other torrents other than this one, and that is the name of the regiment. How can you not love that?
It's great.
It's very much a book written by someone who you can tell understands the way that even the 40K community works.
Yep.
By adding all of those Imperial Army factions and everything, it opens up so many doors to hobbyists and lore writers, and it just really sets the groundwork for the Horus Heresy community of, like, the game itself. Because you have people making Lucifer Black's armies and Geno 5-2 Chiliad, etc. And it's really crucial that this book sets that up, because it opens up the universe to an extent that none of the books so far have.
This is a book by someone who loved Visions of Heresy.
Yes,
because it is Blanchian in the purest sense, in that, like, the simple way that a lot of these regiments are described, like, I believe the Geno 5-2 Chiliad were Shakos. Like, that's them on the cover. The Neil Roberts artwork using John Blanche's, like, I'm just going to put future soldiers in Shakos because it looks cool. Why not?
It looks so fucking cool.
It looks so cool.
Yeah. I was saying a point about, the actual Alpha Legion itself from the book, which, while they're not in it that much, I still think this book provides, at least what I think, is the best and most interesting portrayal of them, in that they are very much a faction that, depending on how they are written, can get very goofy very fast. Like, I'm not going to name any names, but there are definitely books later on in the Heresy series, especially, where it's just full clown town, where it essentially boils down to, like, a Monty Python book. Nobody expects the Alpha Legion.
It is an unfortunate.
They're just Space Marines that are spies, and I love that. Yeah. I love it so much.
It is an unfortunate aspect of Alpha Legion lore that they lend themselves, again, very easily to Flanderization. The whole plans within plans aspect, the plausible deniability, the fact that, the Legion might not tell everyone within the Legion everything that the Legion is doing, leads to wonderful narratives if you can manage to stick the landing with them. But that's unfortunately just not always the case. And again, it can come down to a very, just as planned. You've fallen for my sinister scheme. I was Alfarius all along. Oh no, I'm not Alfarius. Like, you're Alfarius. Like, it is easy to meme them.
And I think that's the case for, like, a lot of the plot points in this book. It's Dan Abnett sets up a lot of storylines that only he and a few other select authors, I could say probably John French and ADB and Chris Wright. He sets
Shout
up
out to Rob Sanders, too. Rob Sanders has some good Alpha Legion stuff mid-Heresy.
Mike Brooks, too.
But he sets up ideas that only a few people are equipped to handle.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is, to an extent, the curse of Dan's genius.
Yeah.
Is,
being
able to introduce plot points that people will only be able to carry forward to a certain degree.
Yeah, I maintain one of the greatest lines in the entire Siege of Terra series is this. There's a discussion with a nameless Alpha Legion Marine and one of the immortal perpetuals, and starts to say the line, "I am Alfarius," at which point he's interrupted and just says, "Man, if you complete that goddamn sentence, I'm going to crash this plane and kill us all."
That was Chris Wright working out some tension.
Yep. Yeah. Yes, it was.
I have to feel.
That's from Warhawk, and it's one of my favorite sequences in like all of 40K. It's so great.
So yes, if you haven't read it, Legion is the birth of the I am Alfarius line. And again, it is a concept that works phenomenally well, in my opinion, when it is baseline humans from the Exertus Imperialis interacting with them. They operate in a way that we've never seen Space Marines operate. They are pragmatic in a way that we've never seen Space Marines operate. They don't function like the Space Marines we're used to. And then we're also treated to the fact that Alfarius is actually two people. Legitimately. Built up throughout the entire book is the idea that the Alpha Legion are just impersonating their Primarch at all times, and then it's revealed that there are actually two Primarchs. Which, if you want to talk about what impact a novel can make in lore, this is it. Something that fits perfectly within everything that's been done before, and yet at the same time is wholly new in ways completely unexpected.
Hey, if you listen to Bly, there were actually 3 of them. So, who knows?
Oh boy, that whole we are not going down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, we'll be here all night.
I mean, I don't know how you guys felt about the Alfarius Omegon revelation when you first read it. I adored it. Mind you, I was younger.
It's so fitting.
Oh yeah, exactly.
It is so fitting.
And it tracks really nicely with the Black Books, which give us multiple different origins for Alfarius, and then ends each one of them with, "This is a lie."
The Black Books are a building upon the lore of Legion. However, Legion is a building upon the lore of the Index Astartes article, which simply talks about how, after the death of their Primarch, the Alpha Legion's ability to prosecute its war was not diminished in any way, shape, or form. Now, you introduce with that, especially, again, this is 2008, it's years before the whole Battle of Pluto thing, you introduce into the idea that, like, oh, wait, if they impersonate each other, then maybe Alfarius didn't die. And kick off the wonderful tradition of the Alpha Legion being my biggest litmus test for an individual's ability to handle ambiguity when it comes to their fictional settings. If you can't grasp that you're never going to get a full answer with the Alpha Legion, and that's the fun, I have thoughts about how you deal with lore. It's my most problematic opinion. Maybe.
That's not problematic.
Oh, dude,
That's
you've got
true.
way worse opinions than that. Good God. It's not even top 10 to me break.
Yeah, ask me about my thoughts on John Grammaticus. Oh, wait, we did that. The Alpha Legion are a beautiful mystery, and they are always at their best when they are a beautiful mystery. When they're explored too much, when you're not left with questions about them, that's when it gets into meme territory. And Legion is just, I could talk about this book all night.
Yeah.
Another little, something I've always loved about it as well, when the Cabal show up for the first time, the Eldar Exarch frames, Grammaticus talks about the Eldar framing the statement in an accusative tense, which is just a wonderfully weird way of describing the fact that, like, this language is super alien, that they have a whole grammatical tense built into it for accusations. I don't know. It's bits like that that they just stick. They just stick.
And the fact that Dan is just able to, like, conjure stuff like that continually, just out of thin air. Like, it's like a superpower. I don't know how he always manages to do it.
Thematically, it fits in really well with his later Inquisition cycle books, too.
And speaking of the Cabal, we are left with, again, the final incredible capstone to the lore of the Alpha Legion. And again, building on that Index Astartes article, which states that their battle cry is "for the Emperor," which was always assumed to be mocking. Legion introduces the idea that the Alpha Legion turned traitor because it was the better outcome that Horus wins. That if the Emperor survived, the galaxy would fall to ruin and chaos would win. But if Horus won, chaos blows itself out in a few generations and consumes itself, and the galaxy can still start again. The idea that there are loyalist traitors wholly upends how the heresy is understood. And again, is just one of the most profound gifts that this book gave the series and the setting.
Yeah, and one which bears pretty fascinating fruit near the tail end of the Siege of Terra books.
Yes, it does. That's one of my favorite parts of the Siege, just seeing how the Alpha Legion's plans ultimately play out.
Yes.
It's kind of remarkable that they managed to tie it up in a satisfying way, because it feels like one of those things that will only end poorly, but it doesn't. It's very good.
Yeah.
Or does it?
Or does it? It's the Alpha Legion. We can't be sure.
And again, the debate has always ended up going on. Like, are the Alpha Legion actually the ones who can see everything, or are the Alpha Legion disappearing up their own asses with their surety that they know everything?
And the answer to that is yes.
Yes.
Or no. Well,
and that's Legion, and that is the first. How many is that?
That's the first 7.
Seven. The first 7 books in the Horus Heresy series, covered in a record time of under an hour and a half.
Yay, we did it.
We did 7. Woo. Only 47 more to go.
We haven't even gotten to the books that like Sal and I have genuine vendettas against too. Oh, y'all. Like, stick around. The manifestos are written. Oh, watch your back.
It's gonna be a good start to the next time we cover these.
My vendettas start with like book 32, so
mine's around the corner. Because mine starts with 12.
I have a vendetta against the next one in a way that.
Okay, but everyone does.
Everyone does. Yeah, that is a frigid take. But until such a time as we regain our stamina and again forge through the Heresy series and to other topics besides, this podcast will not be purely dedicated towards ranting about prose. It has been wonderful having you here. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for supporting everything I do. It means the world to me. So until the time as we gather again, I have an Oculus Imperia. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for tuning back in, guys. Catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in. Always good to talk about it. Don't worry. I have more hot takes coming.
Ave hot takes. And so on.